We pray over these days of awe that we be inscribed in the book of life, that we be inscribed for a year of peace and health and prosperity. But it's not enough for us to look out just for our own individual year and our own individual hopes for peace and health and prosperity, but to look at the state of our nation, and particularly the state of people of color in this country. I had the opportunity earlier this year to visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Birmingham, Alabama, which is an extensive museum and memorial documenting America's history of domestic racial terrorism, from slavery through Jim Crow, from the KKK to the rise of white nationalists in the halls of power right now. And it was, in many ways, a confusing and disorienting experience for me to visit that museum. I've had the opportunity to visit Holocaust museums all around the world, Berlin, Washington, Jerusalem. And when I visit the Holocaust memorials, I have no ambiguity about who I am. I visit Auschwitz, I visit Yad Vashem in Jerusalem as a Jew, not as a German or a Pole. But walking those halls in Alabama, I wasn't quite sure where to locate myself. In some ways, of course, I have more in common with people of color in this country, subject to the violent whims of white Christianity. But in other ways, as a man with white skin, I have more in common, far more than I like to admit. I have far more in common with the oppressor than the oppressed. Generally speaking, as long as I abide by the social norms and dress in the right way and go to the right schools, I can walk the halls of power in this country unmolested as a Jew. It's a difficult thing for me to reckon with the ways in which I, as a Jewish person, am also a beneficiary of white supremacy. It's not privilege I ever looked for, it's not privilege I ever signed up for, and it's not privilege that I want. But it's mine nevertheless. I'm not worried about being incarcerated unjustly. I'm not worried about my neighborhood being redlined. I'm not worried about my children being shot by the police for, at worst, youthful indiscretions. But that is the reality for millions of people of color in this country. As we move forward into Sefer Hayyim, which Ellen will chant for us in just a few moments, I invite us, particularly the white members of this community, to do the uncomfortable work of reflecting on the ways in which we have benefited from white supremacy without ever asking for it. I invite you to consider, are the municipal services in your neighborhood regularly maintained? Are the streets cleaned? Are the sewers clear of debris? Are there supermarkets or places to get fresh food and vegetables easily accessible to where you live? Have you inherited wealth in your family? Not tremendous sums of wealth, not Jeff Bezos sums of wealth, but did somebody own a house and be able to pass that on to the next generation? I know in my family, the fact that my grandfather was able to purchase an apartment in Brooklyn through the GI Bill enabled me and my brother in part to go to college. Out of the hundreds of thousands of mortgages that were signed by the GI Bill in the New York area, only 7 of them were issued to people of color. That is a function of white supremacy that I never signed up for, but from which I benefit. After Ellen leads us in Sefer Hayyim, we'll hear from BHA member Mark Ungar on some of the dynamics of white supremacy, particularly with regards to policing. Mark is a professor of political science and criminal justice at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York, and he also works with the United Nations on police reform around the world. He lives here in Beacon with his husband Bob and their son Dylan.
בספר חיים ברכה ושלום ופרנסה טובה נזכר ונכתב לפניך אנחנו וכל עמך בית ישראל לחיים טובים ולשלום Sefer Hayyim beracha v'shalom u'farnasa tova nizacher v'nikatev lefanecha anachnu v'chol amcha Beit Yisrael L'chaim tovim u'leshalom Baruch atah Adonai Oseh HaShalom.
Thank you, Brent and Ellen and everyone, for the opportunity to participate in our high holiday services this year. Of course, central to today is our collective hope for a year of peace, sustenance, and blessing. And it is good to remember that, like past years, it will be a year made up of moments and also bound up with centuries. Those moments happen when we make a new connection, venture beyond our usual radius, try to understand something with a more critical eye. So in our current effort to rid U.S. policing of racism, that means learning and looking together at each piece that comprises it. How police officers are trained, why police unions resist change, why prosecutors charge African Americans at higher rates and for lesser crimes, how community policing has worked, and what terms like broken windows and zero tolerance actually mean. Only by uncovering these basic building blocks can we actually begin to replace them. And there's also a process stretching out over generations. One Black Lives Matter organizer described it as a claim to recognize Black people's full humanity, which seems like a very long and painful process, extending back centuries, with each achievement feeling like a slippery rock under a powerful tide. But that long history shows us also that we can slowly shift those tides as well. My father tells me that at his bar mitzvah in 1939, as Nazism spread across Europe, his father spoke about stepping into a deep darkness with the light of Jewish history to get through it. From the 1960s and 1980s, we now see more clearly the contributions of the civil rights movement, the fights for women's equality, and LGBT rights. This fall, I am teaching a class on democratization for democratic activists from around the world, in countries as far-flung as Ukraine, Syria, and Burma. Many of them have been arrested, many are from ethnic minorities, but all of them have no doubt that future years will be ones of the peace, sustenance, and blessing we are now coming together to create, and how this moment is a moment that makes up centuries in the fight for humanity that allows such blessing and peace to be fully shared and to long endure. Thank you.